Hi, I'm Rick Smith. My father was Patrick Smith, the author of the book A Land Remembered. Some students sent me questions about the book, and I'm going to do my best to answer them. What you have to realize is I didn't write the book, and unfortunately my father's no longer with us, so I can't ask him, but I'll do the best I can. How did your dad feel about the outcome of this novel? He felt great. The book was a big success, and beyond that, I think he loved the fact that it touched so many people on so many levels, and especially Florida crackers, people who had been here for many generations, thought he wrote this book about their family. It so accurately portrayed those early pioneers that a lot of these families thought it was their family, and I think he got a big kick out of that. Why didn't we hear more of the Seminoles' point of view? Well, he wrote the book the way he wrote the book, and the point wasn't necessarily to get that across. The Makai Vees had a lot of interaction with the Seminoles. My dad did write two other books, one called Forever Island and one called Alapata, that were about the Seminoles. And I think in those he learned, in the course of writing those, he learned about the Seminoles' philosophy and their way of life. And if you want more of that, you should read those books. But he had to write those books to learn enough about the Seminoles to bring that element realistically into A Land Remembered. Did your dad actually travel to the places he discussed in the book? Yes, he did. He traveled all over Florida. It took him about 2 years of research to write that book, and a lot of the research was reading other books about Florida, but it was also traveling around, seeing places that he wanted to write about. And as you read that book, you'll see that he writes a lot about the geography and the topography of the land. He describes the plants in great detail, what was growing there, what Zech and Tobias were seeing when they were traveling down to see the Indians down south of Lake Okeechobee. So he was a very good observer of nature, and he traveled a lot, kept very comprehensive notes of what he saw so that he could write about that in the book. Why didn't we hear about Zech's Indian marriage to Towanda? Well, I don't think they got married. Zech obviously loved Towanda, and he was torn. He loved Glenda, and Glenda was very different from Towanda. He said Towanda smelled like pine needles and smoke, and Glenda smelled like flowers. They were just two very different worlds. He stayed in the white man's world and married Glenda, and that's just the way Dad wrote about it. When you researched, how did your dad pick the events that you wanted to share in the book? Well, he wanted to base the book in reality. It's a fiction book, but he wanted to write about things that really happened. And so the natural disasters, the freezes and the floods and the hurricanes and all those things, the swarms of mosquitoes, those are all based on facts that he read about. And that's one of the reasons I think so many people think this book is a historical, telling the history of Florida. It isn't really. It's a novel, but a lot of schools even use it when they're teaching Florida history because it so accurately portrays what happened back then, just in a more dramatic way. How did your dad know that there was only one surviving Timucuan Indian? I have no idea. I don't know if he made that up, where he came up with that story. The old man came in and warned him, don't go that way. There's only death that way, if they went into that swamp area, and they almost did. They started to go in there. He took Skillet and I think Frog, or Zech was with him, and they started into this swamp, and the alligators nearly got him. I don't know where he came up with that story, but it just adds another element to it. Were the Makai Vees real people? No, they weren't. What he says is, doing all his research, he came up, he kind of like took a lot of pioneer families, typical pioneer families, and made them all part of the Makai Vee family. There never was a one Makai Vee family. They're just typical Florida pioneers. Why did so many people die in A Land Remembered? I'll tell you what, I'm reading the book right now for the 6th time, and it breaks my heart every time somebody dies. And I know it's coming, so I have as hard a time with that as you do. But when you think about it, this book covers 110 years, and when it started, Tobias was 30 years old. So people don't live that long. So as you go through 3 generations, they're going to pass away. Sometimes they pass away in very unpleasant ways. This is a novel. It's meant to get people captured into the story, make them feel things. And if everything had gone well, if everything had been smooth and rosy, nobody died, it wouldn't be as good of a story. So to make the story good, he had to do that. And, that's just a reflection of life back then, too. There were harsh times. People were exposed to a lot more dangers back then than they typically are today. Also, one thing he would say, people would ask him sometimes, why did you kill everybody? And he would say, I just got tired of writing it. He said at 403 pages, he was done. He was just tired. Does Saul regret what he did to the land? Yes, he certainly did. He regretted it very much. In the regular version of the book, it opens with a chapter with him driving through Miami, looking at all the buildings and the houses that he helped build and feeling very regretful about that. And there's a scene at the end of the book where he's speaking to a group of people, and it's obvious that he really resented what he had done. And I kind of think Dad based Saul on Solomon in the Bible, because in the Bible Saul became very rich, very powerful and wealthy, but he regretted it at the end of his life. He saw that wealth and power weren't everything, and so I think Dad may have based Saul on Solomon in the Bible. What made Patrick Smith write the book? Well, as I said, he wrote 3 books before this about Florida. He wrote the 2 about the Indians, Forever Island and Allapattah, and he wrote one about migrant workers down in South Florida, one called Angel City. So that was over a period of maybe 10 years. So he was really into writing about Florida. He was becoming known as a Florida writer. And he said one of the reasons he wrote the book was that nobody had written a sweeping saga like this. There had been books about the pioneers and there were history books about Florida, but nobody had ever written a novel that covered that long a period of time, 110 years. And he just wanted to do it. And I think partly my mother was born in Florida. Her mother was born in Florida. Her family her grandfather was born in Florida. So her family went back to the early times of civilization in Florida. And he stole a lot of stories from them, and I think was just inspired to write this. How long did it take him to write it? It took him about 2 years to research it, and another 1.5 to 2 years to write it and edit it and rewrite it. So all told, probably a little over 3 to 4 years to write this book. What's interesting, the very first book he wrote, one called The River is Home, he wrote that book in 10 days. What happened to Skillet and his family when they moved away? Well, I'm sorry to tell you, there's no answer for that. This book is fiction. There really was no Skillet and Pearlie Mae, so you have to make that one up in your own mind. Maybe someday somebody will write a story about Skillet and Pearlie Mae, but when Dad wrote them out of the book, that was it. Where did your dad get everyone's names? Well, like I just said, I think maybe he got Saul's name from Solomon in the Bible, and my mother's grandfather, my great-grandfather's name was Tobias. So I think I know Dad borrowed the name Tobias from him. The rest of them, I'm not sure. I think, Frog and Bonzo, those are fun names. Glinda, he used a red-haired Glinda in his other book, one called The Seas That Mourn. So sometime in his life, I think he knew a woman with the name of Glinda with red hair, and that inspired him to use that name. And he picked names back then that people would have had back then. Emma would be a typical name. If he'd called Glinda Brittany or Brianna or one of those modern girl names, that wouldn't have worked. If Saul had been Billy or, Zech. I think the names he picked fit the time period very well. Was your dad's life anything like what he wrote about in the book? Not really. He got to know a lot of the people whose ancestors lived like this, but he was born in the 20th century, so he didn't really live like that. Why did you revise the book and make a student version? Actually, he didn't have anything to do with that. Some teachers realized that the students really loved the book and they were reading it to them in classes, but there are some scenes in the regular version that are kind of hard to read for younger readers. So these teachers took it on themselves to take the book and edit some scenes down to make it a little bit more tolerable for younger readers, and they came out with this 2-volume version. I think when you're older, if you're not reading the full version, when you're a little older, you should get the regular version and read it. I think you'll enjoy it. It's really not that much harder to read. It's not harder to read. Some of the scenes are a little bit harsher, but I advise you when you're a little older to read that version too. What inspired your dad to write the book, A Land Remembered? Well, as I said, I think he was inspired by my mother's side of the family who had been here for several generations. In the course of writing Forever Island and Allapattah and Angel City, he really got to know a lot about Florida. He traveled all over Florida, met a lot of old pioneer families, and I think just because nobody had done it before and he was getting to be really well known as a Florida writer and he was looking for one big story to tell, that's what got him to do it. Now, to be honest with you, he never wrote this book with students in mind. It's not a children's book, you know, to call it that. He just wrote the book. And he was very surprised but very pleased that students fell in love with the book so much. Many teachers and parents have said, we couldn't get this child to read a book until we gave him this book. And that was the first book they read front to back. And I think that's a real tribute to my father's writing skills, to the story. He's very happy about that. And I'm very proud of it too. I hope that answers your questions, and maybe I look forward to speaking at your school one day. When you get a little bit older, read the full version. Thank you very much.